Hello. Can you hear me? Merhaba. Okay. I can't see the time. Have we got another minute or two? Oops. Oops. Okay. I'm just chat. Hold on. Ezra, can you hear me? I'm just checking the sound is working. Hello. I think that should be working. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to talk about this article by Putnam. Who read it? Did people read the Putnam? How did you find it? Is it hard?
In the end, I didn't quite understand how we got from the guidance very so he conjuncted.
Well, let's talk about that. What do people? Who else read it? I just want to just get an idea. How did you find it?
I think it was kind of understandable way that the other readings don't provide that much background information about what they are getting. So I think Putnam really provides information about what she's trying to contradict, and that's why it's more understandable.
Yeah. So I think that the one thing is that he's offering this as, so I think the interesting thing is that I think Putnam and people influenced by Putnam, most of them are materialists. They're not dualists, but they defend a form of non-reductive materialism. So and non-reductive materialism has got to do with whether you think that, in some sense, you could just get rid of all of the non-physical properties. Yeah? So according to the identity theorists, that mental properties just are a particular type of physical property. So in our basic understanding of the universe, all there are physical properties. There aren't any non-physical properties. I take it that Putnam thinks that mental properties are not physical properties in one sense of is not. Yeah, the properties themselves now that they may be realized by physical entities. So you have the property and you have it realized that, but the properties themselves are properties that are functional properties. Yeah, and if you think that if you think you've got this kind of you've got different levels of different types of properties, yeah, it's going to turn out that the part of what you've got is you've got an idea that you've got these different sciences that deal with different properties. So this sort of functionalism, it's a form of non-reductive. I mean, most functionalists are non-reductive materialists, and there's some belief in the sort of autonomy of psychology. Yeah, that you know, physics deals with a certain set of properties. You have atoms, you have quarks, you have spin. Yeah, so you've got a bunch of properties. You get physical theories, but then you have a different set of properties that psychology deals with, and these properties are individuated in terms of their functional role. And so psychology as a science or psychology as a discipline deals with a kind of different set of properties than physics. And the properties that psychology deals with can't be reduced to physical properties. Yes. Why is that? Because it's not because there's some mysterious non-physical Cartesian properties, but it's because they're functional properties. That's basically the idea. And we're going to, if you didn't understand that, then don't worry, hopefully by the end of class, you will. In terms of his attitude towards identity theory, yeah, an identity theory says mental states as types are identical to physical states as types. So the pain is a particular type of brain state. Haven't actually end up rejecting that theory. So section 3, he compares functionalism to the identity theory. And basically, it's quite difficult. So I think section 3, it takes a little bit of working out why he's saying that. But in section 3, we've basically got a rejection of identity theory. Yeah. So I want to work through this paper. I think it's quite a difficult paper. I don't know if you find it easy. Either that's really good, or do you find it easy? No, yeah. If you found it easy, either that's really good, or maybe you misunderstood it. I don't know. Yeah, but I think it's quite a difficult paper. It's a bit fiddly. It's quite difficult to understand. It was written in the 60s, the sort of views it's working against. And it was very influential because I think this paper, and especially section 3 of this paper, sort of really changed people's minds. Yeah, oh, yeah, mental states aren't physical states. So let's and it led, I think the dominant view in philosophy of mind, at least until recently, I think probably it's still the mainstream view, is a sort of non-reductive materialism, is a sort of functionalism. I think this view is sort of dominant in psychology. So who's a psychologist here? Yeah, so if you're a psychologist, this sort of functionalist way of, I don't know if you think about it in these terms, but within psychology, I think the basic ideology of a lot of psychology is committed to a form of non-reductive materialism. You've got the idea of the autonomy of psychology. Any sort of computational view of the mind tends to be committed to a form of functionalism. So let's work through this paper. So section 1 is really fiddly, and I think he could have got rid of it. I'm not sure. He could have said section 1 in a few sentences. But what's the point of section 1? So this is on page, starting on page 158. The identity question. people look at this? We're talking about the Putnam paper now. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Putnam. On Tuesday next week, we're going to talk about Mart, and then we're going to start looking at some critics of computationalism. Yeah, so what's the point in section 1? And if you're like, I've got no idea, that's a fairly, when I read this for the first time, I was like, I had no idea what he was getting at. Now I'm a bit older, I'm like, oh yeah, he's trying to do something really simple, and he's making a real mess of it. So what's going on in section 1? I think it was, I mean, he makes a distinction between concepts and properties. Yeah, and I take it that yeah. So what is this distinction he makes between concepts and properties, and why is he making it? Yeah.
I haven't read it, but like from what I see here, and from the things that you have said last section, last about like description and explanation, and here talking about like this is equal this. We are not talking about its properties. That would be like an explanation. But we are like connecting two different terms into one another. So we are not explaining two things, but explaining one thing. So this is
okay. I think you've said what's going on there, but using your own vocabulary, not yeah. I mean, I take it that once again, I'm just going to hit on this. The distinction he's making between concepts and properties is, I take it, a sort of version of the Frege distinction between sense and reference. So this is something that if you're from philosophy, you probably agree board of. Well, have you talked about this in lots of classes, philosophers?
No.
Oh, you haven't read Frege? Okay. Okay, yes. So one thing that's really weird about philosophy undergrad, you don't have a mass philosophy of language class. So that's one of the things that yeah. Okay. So let me just, because this is really important, and I think for non-philosophers, it's something that one of the big things in 20th century philosophy has to do with this distinction between sense and reference. And Frege introduces this in terms of singular things. So we've got objects. So let's suppose we've got objects, we've got people, and we can have various ways of referring to them. So you can use the word Lucas, or you can use the word in English philosopher, philosophy. Or you could have the author of blah, 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 blah. Yeah, you've got these two different descriptions, two different, and these two descriptions both refer to the same object. Yeah, so you've got a single reference. Yeah, but you've got two descriptions. Now, Frege himself, I think, or many people following Frege, thought of concepts, the content of concepts, as something like descriptions. Yeah, so you can have more than. You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, the difference between intention and extension is also related with that, right?
Yeah, so you might think this is the distinction between intention and extension. Yeah, that when we talk about properties, we often talk about we've got a name and then we've got an extension. Yeah, and so I mean, one thing about properties is what are properties. One view of properties is what properties are as sets. Yeah, so you might think that is a cat. Yeah, that's a concept. Is a cat or a predicate. From the level of sense, you have things like you can have intention, you can have a description, you can have various descriptions of the same thing. You can have the the distinction between words and what they refer to, that you can have something like a predicate and a property. Yeah. So you might think a predicate is going to be something like is a cat. That's sort of a linguistic device. It's something on the language side, and then it picks out the property of being a cat. And what are properties? Well, there's lots of arguments. I think the kind of crudest version of what properties are that we have individuals, which are kind of one thing. Then we might think that properties pick out sets. Yeah, so in set theory, people who want to model language using set theory, often if you've done logic, you've got a predicate, you've got names A, B, C, and these are names of individuals. They pick out individuals in your set, and then you have predicates F, G, and these are like names of properties. And then if you've done basic baby logic, then what they pick out are sets of individuals. And then to say that F is A, you're basically saying what this picks out is contained in the set that this picks out. So when you say Lucas is a philosopher, Lucas picks out the property, Lucas is just a single individual, and then you've got is a philosopher, the predicate, and this picks out the set of all philosophers. And then this sentence is true, Lucas is a philosopher is true, if A is a member of the set picked out by F. That's kind of, that's how, if you've done logic, that's how you make the distinction between something like concepts and properties. Yeah. But I think what's important is that it's quite easy to see how this distinction between sort of descriptions in individuals or names in individuals. So one individual can have two names. You know, I'm Lucas. You know, Ali Jan hopefully will call me Daddy. Hasn't said it yet. He said Annie. Yeah, so it's not fair. He said good night. Yeah. He hasn't said Daddy yet. We're really. I think he had a problem with the D. He hasn't got that. He's really good at he's tried to say good night. Yeah, but yeah, so let me get this a bit cleaner. So you know, we can have two ways. So Frege, when he's talking about this distinction between sense and reference, talks about on the concept side. He said we've got modes of presentation. Yeah, and we can have more than one mode of presentation of the same thing. And the reason why this distinction is important is when we say, you know, heat is mean kinetic energy. We've got two bits of language, and we might think that you can know this without knowing this. So the idea is that we have two distinct concepts, but these two distinct concepts pick out the same property. Yeah. So I mean, when you're thinking about, so we have two senses, two concepts. Yeah, but we have one property. Now, one thing is that what is it that makes these distinct concepts? And you might think that well, one way of knowing that you've got distinct concepts is you could know this is heat without knowing this. You can possess this concept without possessing this concept. So the concepts are distinct, but you might think that, well, they pick out the same property in the world. Yeah, we've discovered that what this is this. And this concept is a kind of common sense pre-scientific concept. Okay? Concept that it's part of our everyday language. It's a non-theoretical, in some sense, concept. And here, being kinetic energy is a concept that we can only possess as part of a theory. So to have the idea of mean kinetic energy, you need something like, well, you've got these molecules. Water or air is made up of molecules, and these molecules move around a bit, and that so mean kinetic energy is a concept that only is understandable within a theory. Yeah, you don't need to know anything about molecules to have the concept of heat. But the concept mean kinetic energy is a concept that is only understandable within the context of the theory. So obviously these mean quite different things because you don't need to know anything about molecules to know what heat is. But to understand mean kinetic energy, to understand what this means, you have to know a whole bunch of other stuff. You have to understand the basic theory in which it's embedded. One thing that's interesting is that often we have these common sense concepts, and then we have these concepts that are theoretical concepts. And I think that these theoretical concepts are concepts that can only be understood holistically. You have to understand how this concept fits into a larger theory. My sort of take is you might think that these are sort of atomistic concepts, that it refers to something in the world and you know how to recognize something in the world. And you don't need to understand a whole bunch of other bits of language to understand what heat is. Maybe. I might disagree that later. But these sort of scientific theories are things that you can only understand by understanding a theory as a whole. And this is basically the point he's making in section 1, that we need to make a distinction between concepts on the one hand, and the properties these concepts, the properties or individuals these concepts pick out on the other hand. Question?
I don't know if this makes sense. Now, I understand that this of all depends on the assumption that the things in the world doesn't change, so properties always stay the same, and we can be we can use different properties to mean the same thing, but the same thing doesn't change. I lost your question.
Yeah, so I mean, in the past, like a couple of semesters ago, I did a graduate seminar on concepts. And there's a lot to be said about concepts and how we pick things out. I'm sort of attracted to a sort of view, at least of many concepts, where in some sense it can't all be going on in the head. Yeah, so we've got a concept like cat, and we learn the concept cat by a particular cat. But then for this concept to have some sort of stable meaning, there has to be something in the world, some kind of species, cats in the world. Yeah, there has to be some stability in the world. There has to be, in some sense, cat. In order for the word cat to refer, that cats have to be some sort of real kind. So our use of language presupposes at least some sort of stability in the world. No, I think there is enough stability in the world for our language to work. And what evidence do we have for that? Well, our language works. It's a bit messy. We don't have total stability, so it's sort of a bit messy at the edges. But yeah, I do think that for language to work, for thought to be able to grasp the world, that this presupposes that there's a certain type of stability in the world. Yeah, that we have in terms for individuals and terms for kinds, and that for me sort of suggests that our language sort of works, and that the only way it can work is if there really are some at least good enough kinds. It's not like you've got, you know, like when we think about terms like dog or human, you know, the Aristotelian, the pre-19th century view was that natural kinds are fixed and eternal, that there's some essence that all human beings have that makes them human. I take it today, when we think of biology, biological kinds are a lot messier. That to be a member of the same species has got to do with the ability to kind of interbreed with one another. And it turns out to be really messy because, you know, it's not transitive. So A and B can interbreed and B and C can interbreed, but A and C can't interbreed. Yeah. And so in some sense, being a member of the same species, for example, is quite messy given our modern biology. It's not clean like the medieval Aristotelian view, but it's good enough. Yeah, there's enough kind of stability. I think you're right that this distinction presupposes there's a certain type of stability in the world. I take it that this is an idealization, and properties in the world are actually quite messy and fuzzy at the edges, but we sort of presuppose they're a bit cleaner than they are in our language, because that's how language works. And that sort of means that when we get to the limits, we get into a mess. So we're quite good at applying terms to the core, but then we have problems with sort of the edges of application. Yeah, there are cases where it's not quite clear. Yeah.
Does this model system apply if what we have in a common sense language, something like a chair, is like one particular object, but its scientific definition is like composite? For example, chair, if you would like to describe it in scientific terms, would not be a term that is like understandable because it would like consist of too many materials and configurations.
Yeah, so I take it like a term like chair is weird. I take it a term like chair is basically a functional property. Yeah, so what makes something a chair is what you can do with it and how it fulfills a certain type of role.
We're talking about simple,
Well,
not like not in a mass, but not like objects, but symbols. Like
so one thing I would say is that you can have like, we've got sense and reference, and we've got concepts and properties. We've also got words. Yeah, so do we have three things or do we have two things? So we might think, for example, we have chair and we have sandalye. Yeah, and so and then we might have a concept, and then we have a chair. So when people in philosophy and people working on concepts, that quite often, if you're reading an article or you're writing an article, you've got to distinguish between words, concepts, and objects. Yeah, and so people have kind of adopted this convention. Like when you're talking about word, you put it in quotation marks, and that means what I'm talking about is the word chair. Then you have concept, chair, you write it in capitals, and then if you want to talk about chairs, if you want to talk about the reference, you use the word as you normally use it. Because normally when you use a word, you don't use a word to refer to a concept, you use the word to refer to something. Now, I mean, this is how it looks like on the surface. That you have words, you have concepts, and you have objects. Now, you might just think you can get rid of concepts, and all you have are words and objects. This is one sort of approach. This is, I think, this is nominalists think that we kind of get by just with words and objects. And I think that so, I mean, we've got these two words, chair and sandalye. Are these two words for the same concept? Yeah, have we got kind of something? We've got the objects and we've got the things in the world. We've got the set of all chairs. Yeah, we've got the word. Do we also have a concept? That we have bachelor and unmarried man. So do we need concepts? Do we have the concept of a bachelor? And are these two ways of picking out the same concept? I take it that some people think there's a distinction between what's known as the analytic and the synthetic. So analytic judgments are judgments that are true on the basis of meaning. So if you think that bachelor means unmarried man, in some sense, and you think this is analytic, then what you think is that the concepts are the same. The concept bachelor just is the concept unmarried man. This is something we know not by looking at the world. So all bachelors are unmarried. Now that seems true. How do we know that? Well, we don't have to look at bachelors and check whether each one, we know this by definition. So if it's the case that there are some things that are true by definition, then this seems to suggest that we can distinguish between the concept and the object or the property the concept picks out. One thing that's interesting is Putnam starts this article by distinguishing between concepts and properties. But he's really famous for, in some sense, attacking the analytic. Yeah, so meanings aren't in the head. So Putnam sometimes seems to suggest all you need are words and properties. Yeah, but these are sort of questions in the philosophy of language. I take it that you could get rid of the concepts and make the same point. You can say, well, you've got certain use of language talking about pains, and then you've got this other sort of language talking about functional states. Yeah, once again, you've got a distinction not between two concepts, but between two sets of linguistic devices. So I think, but Putnam in this article seems to suggest that we've got these two things. What's that big noise? Okay, so this is on page 159. And here he's sort of disagreeing with Carnap. So Carnap seems to suggest that same problem. Carnap seems to collapse sameness of concept into sameness of property. Yeah, and this would seem to suggest that all identity statements turn out to be analytic. Yeah, so he says, so one view we might have is that all so whenever you make an identity statement, the identity statement you're making is analytic. You're saying that two things have the same meaning. Say something is analytic is to say that two expressions mean the same thing. But I take it the behaviorists, the classical behaviorists, maybe not right, seem to be committed to something like this. When they say that pain is a behavioral disposition, what they're saying is something about the concept pain. They're trying to offer an account of the meaning of pain. What does it mean to say someone is pain? So the classical behaviorists, coming out of logical positivism, seem to think that all identity statements are analytic. And this is basically what he's rejecting in number one. And this is something that shouldn't be a surprise or weird for you, because this is just something that we also saw in Smart. He also says that this identity statement is not analytic. It's not a claim about sameness of meaning. It's about sameness of reference. So he says on page 159, the effect of saying that the property P1 can be identical with the property P2 only if the terms P1 and P2 are in some suitable sense synonyms. Synonyms means the sameness of meaning. So this, yeah, the view he's looking at here is the claim that all identity statements are analytic. All identity statements, whenever you say one thing is identical to another, you're saying that the two things mean the same thing. Is to all intents and purposes to collapse the two notions of property and concept into a single notion. So if you think all truth, all identity statements are analytic, then there's no real distinction between concept and property. Same property just means same concept. Yeah, so you're saying sameness of property just is sameness of concept. Yeah. The view that concepts, intentions, so who said, so sense, concepts, senses, intentions, you might think of ways of pointing to the same thing. The view that concepts, intentions are the same as properties has been explicitly advocated by Kant in his Meaning and Necessity. Pause. This seems an unfortunate view. This is kind of very polite. Today, I don't know, people are much more kind of aggressive. Like, that's crazy shit. This seems an unfortunate view. Since temperature is mean molecular kinetic energy, appears to be a perfectly good example of a true statement of identity of properties, whereas the concept temperature is the same concept as the concept of mean molecular and kinetic energy is simply false. Yeah, so he just thinks it's obvious that we need to distinguish. Yeah. What? Well, so yeah, so what do we mean when we say two things are the same concept? I mean, I take it that you might think if you've got sameness of concept, then if you understand one, you understand the other. But then you might think, hold on, you've got chair and sandalye. And you might think they pick out the same concept, that these are we've got the same concept expressed in different languages. And I can understand sentences containing chair, but I can't understand sentences containing, I can actually sandalye. Yeah.
Since learning the process, maybe I don't have a hold of the entire concept yet. But they're not the two distinct concepts. But maybe I don't know the concept enough to associate them.
Yeah. So I mean, you might think that kind of think about heat and mean kinetic. Like to understand the word heat, it's sort of atomic. You might think that the concept heat is sort of atomic. It just picks out a certain property in the world. And so to understand the concept of heat, I don't need to understand much else. That I need to kind of have, the sort of concept of heat involves the phenomenology of feeling heat, so insofar as if you're trying to explain what heat means, if I ask you, what does heat mean? And you'll explain to me, if you put your hand in it and this is warm and this is cold, and so in order to understand, so if you ask someone, what does this mean? Now, in order to understand, so there's two questions. What does the word heat mean? We're trying to teach someone heat. You might think this is what you need to know. But then you might say, what is heat? And I take it the sort of Putnam's claim is that these are quite different questions. So if you're asking someone, what does this mean? Now, what does mean kinetic energy mean? Like in order to explain to someone what mean kinetic energy means, you have to explain what mean is, you have to know what an average is. Yeah, so you would have to kind of, okay, well, first of all, before I can explain to you what this means, I have to teach you something about statistics. We have to kind of do a little class in math. You have to know what average is. Kinetic, well, it's movement, but to understand what I mean kinetic energy, that, well, you've got these molecules, they're moving around. So to explain what this means, to understand what mean kinetic energy means, you have to know the meaning of average. You have to know the meaning of mean. Yeah? And you don't need to know anything about averages to understand the word heat. But to understand this expression, so, I mean, I don't get het up on this because this is a whole can of worms, yeah? Like understanding what concepts are and what meanings are is one of, in the 20th century, this was one of the main pastimes of analytic philosophy. It was probably the main thing that philosophy looked at, the philosophy of language and account of what meanings are, what concepts are. And it gets quite messy But the sort of story I've told you is that, well, so I'm explaining meaning, and this is something that many philosophers are going to reject. I'm sort of explaining meaning in terms that appeal to something like the understanding. What do you need to know to understand it? Yeah, so I'm sort of suggesting that meaning is like sort of mentalistic in a certain way. And what you need to understand this term is quite distinct from what you need to understand this term. So this is one way of kind of trying to get some grasp on sameness and distinctness of meaning. Yeah, what do you need to know in order to understand a particular bit of language? And it turns out that, yeah, understanding heat and understanding meaning connect. Now, it turns out if you push it, I think that it turns out that there are no things where you have sameness of meaning. so in some sense, sameness of meaning never occurs, because I think the classic example is bachelor is an unmarried man. I'm not so sure. Like, is the Pope a bachelor? I don't know. Is a priest a bachelor? And, if you start thinking about it, that you could learn the word bachelor without learning unmarried and that you could just be taught there's a bachelor, and you could learn to apply the word, perhaps without learning unmarried and male, and you could do it perfectly well. So maybe you could learn the word bachelor before, because unmarried, so man you might think is a natural kind term, it picks out a member of a particular species. So you need to have an understanding of how that works. And then unmarried involves a whole bunch of stuff about institutions. And yeah, so in states that don't have gay marriage, but people have got common law gay marriage, are they bachelors? They're not legally married. So it seems to me that bachelor and unmarried man, I mean, this may be the definition, but actually the word bachelor doesn't, the extension of bachelor and the extension of unmarried man, it's not obvious that they're absolutely overlapping. So it seems to me that maybe there are no cases of sameness of meaning. Yeah, maybe kind of cat in English, or cat, across language. Maybe when you have got natural kinds in the world, but I'm not sure. I mean, one thing about meaning is often the meaning of a word is holistic. And if you think that meaning is holistic, you change one thing and the meaning changes a little bit. So if your account of meaning involves how something interrelates to other meanings, then it turns out sameness of meaning, you're never going to get exact sameness of meaning. So all you're going to have is similarities of meaning. Yeah, and it comes in degrees. But this is the point of section 1. Let's just distinguish between concepts and properties, and then the claim I'm making that pain is a functional state is that we've got we've got identity of property. So the word pain picks out a property, and being in functional state and then you give a long description, picks out the same property. Yeah? So we've got the same property being picked out by two distinct concepts or two distinct. I mean, if you don't like concepts, if you're a nominalist, you might think you've got two different uses of language, two different bits of you've got two distinct linguistic devices that are picking out the same property in the world. That's the claim. And we're denying an identity of meaning. These things, their meaning is quite distinct. That you can understand this without understanding this. You might be pretty stupid. That you might not be, understanding functional state involves a whole lot of holistic thinking. For a child, they understand what pain is. but not be able to kind of come up with a theory of functional state. Yeah. So that's section 1. Yeah.
Is this the identity of reference of the sort that morning star is the evening star, or does it differ in some?
Yeah, so you know, the classic example that Frege uses in his sense of reference is we say the morning star is the evening star. That Hesperus is phosphorus. So we've got names. I'm going to write it in very bad handwriting because I don't know the spelling. Hesperus is phosphorus. This is the name of the evening star and the morning star. It turns out they're not stars. Yeah, the morning star and the evening star aren't stars. It's Venus. Yeah, so Venus, they, you know, in the ancient world, they saw this star in the morning, then they saw another star at night, and it's a very bright one, and they called one of them the morning star and one of them the. And then they did a bunch of astrology and they discovered how the morning star is the evening star. Yes, Venus. And so here, what we've got is an informative identity. We've got an identity that, you know, they had people go out into the world and they had to do some astrology to discover this was true. And so there's no conceptual analysis that can show you that the morning star is the evening star. And Frege kind of said these things, you've got two terms with different senses, different concepts, different intentions, sameness. The reference is the same, the senses are different. And the reason we need this distinction is because we need some account of informative identity statements. We have identity statements that really take something. Yeah. Lucas is the murderer. We've got two concepts. Lucas, and we've got the murderer. Yeah, and to discover this, you've discovered something quite important. But what you've discovered is co-referentiality. What you've discovered is that term Lucas refers to the same thing as the expression the murderer. Yeah, so I get, you know, the Frege point is that informative identity statements, identity statements that really we learn something through them. And this is a lot of science. It's basically the discovery of informative identity statements. How do we explain these? What's going on? And the idea is informative identity statements work in terms of co-referentiality. What you learn is that these two linguistic devices refer to the same thing. And Frege does it in terms of individuals. That's easier. But we might think of the same thing in terms of properties. Frege was also interested in mathematics. So he thinks this is how mathematical equations work. Yeah, in mathematics, you have co-referentiality. You know, the first prime number after 5 is 7. Is that right? Yeah. So you've got two ways of picking out the same mathematical object. Yeah. And so once again, you need to distinguish between the concept and the object in math. This is Frege's idea. Yeah. So you need to be a sort of Platonist in math to make sense of mathematical identity claims. Okay, so that's section 1. The claim is that like the identity theorists, and unlike the classical behaviorist, that he thinks that he's not making a claim about sameness of meaning. So what is his claim? So this is section 2. What time is it now? Okay, so we're a little bit behind. Yeah, I think this stuff about Frege. I'm not sure I got to get across, but it's a really important thing in 20th century philosophy. And of course, everything's a lot more complicated, but this is worth just going through. I hope you've got the basic idea. So, is pain a brain state? Yeah, so he says, since I'm discussing not what the concept of pain comes to, I'm not talking about the meaning of the word pain. This is on page 161, but what pain is. So we've got two types. Once you've got this distinction between sense and reference, between concept and property, then you've got two distinct types of question. You've got the question about the meaning of a concept, word, and then you've got a concept of what something is. We've got to keep these two things apart. What does the word pain mean? And what is pain? Are two separate questions, you might think. Yeah. Since I'm discussing not what the concept of pain comes to, but what pain is, in a sense of is, which requires empirical theory construction, I should not apologize for advancing an empirical hypothesis. And he says, my strategy will be to argue that pain is not a brain state. Yeah? And I'm going to argue this not on an a priori ground. I'm not going to engage in conceptual analysis. Yeah? But on the ground that another hypothesis is more plausible. Yeah? So pain, we've got two hypotheses. Pain is a brain state. And pain, well, no. And pain is a functional state of the whole organism. And we decide between them. We can't decide between them in terms of conceptual analysis. Yeah, so some philosophers are like, oh, what do you do in philosophy is conceptual analysis. So to answer this question, what we need to do is to understand what the concept of pain is. But no, yeah, that we've got these two hypotheses, pain is a brain state and pain is a functional state, and both of them are fine as hypotheses. But he thinks that we have reason to think that this is a more plausible empirical hypothesis. Yeah, that pain is a functional state of the whole organism is more plausible as an empirical claim than the claim that pain is a brain state. So he says, the detailed development and verification of my hypothesis would be just as utopian a task as the detailed development and verification of the brain state hypothesis. But I think this is interesting. Putnam's now giving us an account of what he thinks the task of philosophy is. What's the division of labor between philosophy and, say, psychology and neuroscience? He says, but the putting forward not of detailed and scientifically finished hypotheses, but of schemata for hypotheses has long been a function of philosophy. And one thing that philosophy does is not put forward hypotheses, but put forward schemata of hypotheses. You might think a schemata of a hypothesis is something like I don't know, like you might think of a Kuhnian paradigm. You might think of a kind of basic conceptual scheme. Yeah. So he says, so he's not putting forward a finished hypothesis, but sort of hypothesis schemata. Yeah, we might think of identity theory and functionalism, not as theories, but as sort of schemata for theory. And then the theories have to be developed by the scientists. Yeah, but we've got these two different schemata for how to develop theories. Yeah, and so pain is a functional state of the whole organism. I should argue that pain is not a brain state in the sense of a physical chemical state of the brain, or even of the whole nervous system, but another kind of state entirely. I should propose the hypothesis that pain, or the state of being in pain, is a functional state of a whole organism. So you've got this distinction between pain is a brain state, and pain is a functional state of a whole organism. And this, I think, one thing that is important is to understand how these are really quite distinct ways of thinking about pain. Yeah, and this is a sort of reductive theory. This ends up being a non-reductive theory. Compatible with physicalism, it is going to be compatible with a sort of non-reductive physicalism, because you've got certain types of properties that can't be cashed out in terms of mechanical terms. You can't, to understand something as a functional state of a whole organism, you can't understand this in terms of decomposing the organism and looking at its parts. You have to sort of, in some sense, it's a sort of holistic property. You have to understand the whole organism. You have to understand how the organism is structured, and then you identify particular properties in terms of their roles. Yeah, so state plane is a functional state of the whole organism that you identify it in terms of functional role. Yeah.
How does this differ from disposition?
Okay, so in section 3, he talks about how this differs from identity theory. In section 4, he talks about how this view differs from behaviorism. I take it that with behaviorism, you've just got a disposition to behave given certain external circumstances. So what goes on internally is just a sort of black box. I take it one thing is that the functionalists think that you've got all of this internal stuff going on. But this internal stuff can be, in some sense, the functional state you might think of as something like nodes. So when you kind of want to refer to a functional state, you have a sort of network, you have a bunch of points all connected by edges, and you specify the network by talking about all the relationships. And then a functional state is to be thought of as a sort of node within a sort of network. Yeah, so it's that's how you individuate them. So one thing about functionalism is that what's going on inside the organism is essential for understanding the state, because what's going on inside the organism is not a black box for the functionalism. It's internally structured, and you individuate these states. They are internal states in some sense. They're internal, or they're what's going on internally is relevant. And yeah, so for example, having a belief. Yeah, so you know, if you're offering a behaviorist account of belief, you say that you know, a belief is a disposition to act in a certain way. So you might think, well, believing beer is in the fridge has a disposition for Lucas to go and get it, a disposition to say there is beer in the fridge if asked. But of course, well, the functionalist is going to say, well, the relationship between a particular individual, a particular mental state and behavior is going to depend upon the other mental states you have. Yeah, so whether or not, you know, whether or not I'm disposed to go and take the beer from the fridge is going to depend upon whether I want a beer. It's going to depend upon whether it's an appropriate time to have a beer. It's going to, whether I think, you know, so that the relationship between an individual state and behavior is going to depend upon how it relates to other states. Yeah.
But isn't this fully compatible with behaviorism as well? It's only distinction between what inside the organism. But I think behaviorism can also account for mental states as some sort of.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a bit like behaviorism in the following term, that it thinks that what state you're in has got to do with something extrinsic. So how you individuate a state is in terms of its extrinsic properties, how it relates, its causal role, rather than thinking that there's some intrinsic property that makes something pain. So you like think about Wittgenstein, the black beetle in the box. What makes something pain is its role rather than its intrinsic nature. Now, that sort of idea from behaviorism, I think functionalism is on the same page there. So the sort of criticisms of behaviorism, you know, from people like Nagel, also apply to functionalism. Yeah, so it wants to say that what makes something the mental state that it is has got to do with its extrinsic relational properties rather than any intrinsic nature. You might be someone who thinks that what makes something pain is that it hurts. It's got a certain phenomenal character to it. And the functionalist, in some sense, gets rid of that. The phenomenal character of the state isn't what makes it the type of state it is. What makes it the type of state it is its role. But yes, I mean, functionalism, yeah, it's quite distinct from behaviorism because it you know, the mind isn't a black box. Yeah, that we can, you know, that the task of the psychologist. So, like, you might think, well, the mainstream version of functionalism is computationalism, so that you can specify in terms of internal states, in terms of algorithms working on internal mental representation. Yeah, so the sort of standard functionalism is quite happy with explaining things in terms of, you know, you've got these internal states that are mental representation, and then you have rule governed operations on these states. And that's the task of psychology is that. And so it opens up a kind of whole set of questions. And when we look at Mart, for example, Mart is this sort of methodology. That sort of methodology isn't open for the behaviorist. Yeah?
I'm in Kyle, it was talking about the different algorithms. Same algorithm could be realized in different like material forms. But we are talking about something that this algorithms have now, that are functional states. So if I have I can have like 3 functional states of 2 that I can share with a different algorithm. Would I have to share all of my functions with another algorithm for it to be the same as mine, for me to be actualized?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, I want to have a break now. So, but I think this is a criticism of functionalism that I think is a kind of quite powerful one. That's what it was meant of, yeah. So I think functionalism claims that it's better than identity theory because we think that both I can feel pain, but dogs can feel pain. That I don't know, lizards can feel pain. Octopodes, is that the plural? How do you say it? Octopuses? Octopi. No, octopi is called, I think it's either octopuses or octopode. It's Greek. Yeah. And the I plural, I think, is Latin. So you're taking a Greek word, putting the Latin plural on, which is just very, you know, if you were to English, oh dear, that's terribly kind of that's very bad class. Yeah. But I think it's octopodes or octopuses. Yeah. Octopuses just sounds wrong, doesn't it? Yeah. Octopodes. Octopi. I say octopi. But octopodes, I think. Yeah, so they feel pain. And then the argument is that they are quite different. The brains work quite differently. Yeah, so there's not a single type of brain state that's shared across all these species. So this is why, because pain is it's realizable in lots of different types of organisms that have different types of internal states, then this is why it can't be a brain state. Yeah, because, yeah. Now, I think we've got the same problem with the functionalist view, because actually the functional organization of an octopus is really different from the functional organization of a human being. And so in what sense do you have, so I take it the sort of thought is that there's some level of description at which the functional organization of an octopus is enough like ours, or is the same as ours, so that we can say both we and the octopus feel pain. Yeah.
Isn't this kind of ad hoc explanation?
What?
Ad hoc explanation. You can you can find similarities ad infinitum with some different levels of description.
Yeah. But I mean, one thing is though that the classic example we're going to see next week is going to be addition, and you might think that an adding machine, that in some sense you've got something, what's it called, a cash register is doing addition, a child can do addition, you've got a calculator can do addition, and in some sense, at some level of description, all of these different systems are doing the same thing. They're all doing addition. Yeah. So I think the thing about functionalism is functionalism is going to involve levels of descriptions. Yeah. There's some level of description at which it's appropriate to say that what's going on here is addition. And there's a level of description of the cash register where it's doing the same thing. So you've got a child doing addition, you've got the cash register where he's doing addition. Yeah. And so I take it that the functionalist is going to say that, well, at some level of description, there's a level of description at which what's going on within the octopus and what's going on in the human is the same, yeah, or is similar enough. Yeah. Now,
the problem here is that the function is based on the effect one another. So the fact that I have function state 1 and 2 is irrelevant to the question, but maybe the function state 1 is being subconscious or having a consciousness, and that would affect function state 2.
Yeah, so I think there's a kind of, I mean, I think there's a sort of similar question about whether people in different languages can understand the same thing. So I think like chair is blue, you think the table leg is blue, I think it in English, you think it in Turkish. Are we thinking the same thing? Yeah. So you might think, yeah, so sometimes with debating, we get into these disagreements about colours. Because I think the Turkish way of carving out colour space is slightly different from the English way of doing it. And so, you know, like I can think, well, I think this is blue, and you think it's blue, and we're thinking the same thing. And then you might think, hold on a minute, though, you're Turkish and I'm English. And so you're actually, you know, when you're thinking of blue, you've got this. And also you seem to be organized a bit differently. Yeah, this is there's some interesting research on basic color terms, psychology. You know this stuff?
Yeah, formatty and Amandol.
Yeah, and this is something that a bunch of Turkish psychologists have worked on. So there was this guy, Emre Bilker, who's now in Izmir, who's got a bunch of publications on this. And it turns out that Turks, if you have this distinction within your language, between Mardi and Lajiver, that it changes when you have to make quick judgments about whether two things are the same or different across a color boundary a basic color boundary in your language, that you're better at the discrimination tasks in terms of accuracy and speed. So it's not just that you have different language, but in some sense, the difference in language is reflected, not necessarily in a difference in how things look. You don't really know that, but a difference, at least in how you perform. Yeah.
I think it's a very small distinction as opposed to the octopi example. You know, we even if different cultures name this color with different terms, it's still we are the same species, but the whole biological organism of an octopus whole different things from us.
Yeah. No, I mean, once you go functionalist, then I mean, you have this between members of the same species. You also have it in developmental terms. So you might think that, like, a child may have certain beliefs, and we attribute beliefs to a child. Like, think about size concepts in a child who hasn't yet, you know, about the kind of Piaget, what's it called, size constancy. Like, you might think that they've got different concepts than us. Yeah. So they're really kind of, and I think that, yeah, there's this Susan Carey, we're going to talk about her work later on. And when we look at her, attributing sameness of concept, how do we do this? And you might think that once again, that part of it is in terms of functional role, and you've got a set of concepts that are interrelated. And as adults, we've got this adult set of concepts. And there's enough similarity to say that we've got the same. But the child, they've got a bunch of concepts, and the developmentalist is trying to work out what these concepts are, but not the way you do that is in terms of partially in terms of their relations to each other and their roles. Let's have a break because I want to get onto section 2, and yeah, we've been talking too much. Well, I've been talking too much, but I think good though. I think we haven't got through. We're a little bit. I mean, it's quite good in the schedule. I'm only about half a class behind schedule, so it's not too bad. So I guess we won't finish Putnam today. I guess maybe I'll say a little bit more about Putnam on Tuesday, and we'll talk about Mar, and then maybe we'll talk a bit about Mar next Wednesday, and then yeah. So we're a little bit behind, but it's not a big deal. Yeah, you were asking about phenomenology. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit weird. I think it's phenomenological tradition started off very Cartesian, but then I think Heidegger and Maramonti, you had this sort of reaction against the Cartesianism, this anti-Cartesianism, a more embodied approach. I'll be at my office. I've got a student coming at 2 o'clock. So yeah, I'll
maybe I can come before till 3:14.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe he'll be there for at least half an hour.
Okay.
But yeah, if you pop by, and then I can be free a little bit after the 314. Okay. Yeah. So I think part of it is you've got this mainstream analytic philosophy, and then you've got these people who are in some sense critics of this. So you've got the people more into process philosophy, and these guys were kind of outside the mainstream. And so I think part of it is these people. So I think part of it is sort of sociological. It's that these people outside of the mainstream join forces, and kind of So one thing is that. Yeah, so you've got so one of the things is that you've got these people coming out phenomenology. So you've got like all these people into subjectivity and intersubjectivity. And then you've got these people coming out behaviorism. And then Gibson and people where subjectivity just, I mean, it's not obvious. That maybe you could say that there's this organism as a whole perspective in a certain sense, but you get that in behaviorism. And I think, behaviorism, Ryle was one of the first reviewers of Being and Time. So, and of course, it's very anti-Heideggerian, but there's a sort of, there is some affinity between Ryle and Heidegger.
Actually, my main purpose in this interpretation is to propose that in today's cognitive science, there is too much of a mental talk and subjective talk that causes some noise in methodological issues, and it leads to bad science practices. The reason why we are dealing with reaction times, ephemera, etc., is that we do not want to we do not want to talk about mental intrinsic mental.
So I'm not sure that's right. So I need to run to the toilet because I've been. But so with Ingi, for example, psychophysics, it seems to me that there you are interested in the mental, and you're actually asking people mental questions. So you're asking them, do these things happen at the same time, or does one happen before the other? So you're asking people to report on how things seem to them, but at the same time you're doing it quite rigorously, and you discover quite robust effects. So I don't know, I think psychophysics is a kind of area in psychology where you are, asking people, you're not just looking at reaction types. And it seems psychophysics is perfectly good science to me.
I have some doubts, but we can
Yeah,
talk later.
I need to run to the toilet. Where's the toilet? It's below. So how is it time to finish the break? forgot to tell you when, because I don't know, I should have two phones. Because they should have clocks in the classrooms. Did no one ever think of that? It would be quite nice having a clock there. It would help keep us more organized. Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at section 2. So he introduces the idea of a Turing machine. Now, I think in some sense this is sort of unhelpful because a Turing machine is, plays a central role in the sort of abstract theory of computation. Yeah, so we have this machine that has a strip. Yeah, and you can mark it. It's got memory and it goes backwards and forwards. And Turing shows that a whole bunch of stuff that is quite complex mathematically can be computed by such a machine. And so this was introduced to give kind of give substance to the idea of whether something is computable. Yeah, whether a function can be solved by such a simple machine. Yeah, so we have the idea of Turing computability. And I think the Turing machine gives us a sort of abstract representation of computability. Now, I mean, people obviously have Turing machines. Yeah, we don't have strings. So to say that the mind is a Turing machine, it's obviously false. Yeah, I take it the idea is that the sort of suggestion is that the brain is a computer. Yeah, and that computers, we can use Turing machines to represent what computers can do. Yeah, but I take it that the way you can have different computers that compute things quite differently. So I think the talk of Turing machines is sort of unhelpful. I take it that today, when people think about computation, we have some raw thought mentality is to be understood in terms of something like the raw governed manipulation of representation or symbols, something like that. Yeah. And of course, this is what a Turing machine is. And the Turing machines play a central role in this abstract theory of computability. But I think that, yeah. So I think
One wanted to be fancy using those tools.
Well, I mean, yeah, because I think you can forget the Turing machine stuff. And then you have all this stuff about pain being a functional role. And what he basically says about pain and the functional role of pain seems to be something that you could have said it's something that Aristotle could have said. So what he says about the functional role of pain seems something that doesn't really require all of this abstract stuff about computers and Turing machines. Now, it turns out that then the application of this is, okay, that the way to understand the mind, the way to do psychology is going to involve the discovery of algorithms. I think that's the sort of central idea that, that we've got some way of understanding what's going on in mentality in terms of algorithms. And we can fully understand the mind by understanding the algorithms which are at work. And of course, once you're at the level of algorithms, then you're at the level of functional description. Yeah, you've got the algorithms. How the algorithms are embodied. All you need is they can be embodied in many different ways. So the hypothesis is that mental states are functional states. Hold on, where is it? Well, I realized I didn't have anything to eat today. I'm starting to get a bit lightheaded. So So we've got this idea that mental states are functional states, and mental operations are basically rule-governed algorithms, can be understood algorithmically. So he says, well, he said the hypothesis, this is on page 163, he says, the hypothesis is admittedly vague, though surely no vaguer than the brain state hypothesis in its present form. So, for example, one would like to know more about the kind of functional organization that an organism must have to be capable of feeling pain, and more about the marks that distinguish the subset of sensory inputs referred to in 4. So he says, well, let's think about what's required for an organism to be in pain. So he said, well, with respect to the first question, one can probably say that the functional organization must include something that resembles a preference function. Yeah. So for an organism to be in pain, it's got to be, for something to be in pain, it's got to be something that has preferences. Yeah. Being in pain is something that the organism prefers not to be in. It's kind of central to the idea. Well, it's central to the idea. Are we doing conceptual analysis here? So he says, with respect to the first question, one could probably say that the functional organization must include something that resembles a preference function, or at least a preference partial ordering, and something that resembles an inductive logic. The machine must be able to learn from experience. So we've got a preference function, capacity for learning. I think this is going to be central to what pain is. In addition, it seems natural to require that the machine possesses pain sensors. Now, of course, we can't specify what pain sensors are using the word pain. Well, once again, we're not supposed to be doing conceptual analysis. What worry is how he puts it out here. It does seem that it's quite easy to think, well, what he's doing here is conceptual analysis of pain. He's giving us the meaning. But he says, sensory organs, which normally signal damage to the body or dangerous temperature pressures. Now, so, you know, the machine prefers not to have damage. So pain involves, in some sense, you've got an organism that is capable of registering or representing. I take it that this idea of pain sensors. I think here that this is ultimately we've got some sort of representational notion. You've got internal states that represent damage to the body. Yeah. And then this sort of being has sort of desire to avoid damage. Now, once again, I guess damage. I think that he talked about damage. He talked about things like low heat, excessive heat. We've got some. I think when you start pushing it, it seems that it's very messy. And then how do you ask, how do you apply this? How do you have a single notion of, and one thing I think is that he starts by introducing Turing machine, and then when he tries to flash it out, he flashes it out in these terms, which in some sense doesn't seem to make any direct reference to the Turing machine, and does look a bit like a kind of an analysis of what the concept of pain is. It seems to be that when you push him, it's like, are you giving an account of what pain is and the property, or are you just doing conceptual analysis? It's not obvious to me why we should think of this as anything more than conceptual analysis. I think it when we look at sort of that Mart's doing, we might take a way of thinking about internal states and understanding them algorithmically. He doesn't really seem to be doing this. Now, one problem that we've got, so this is how he gives a kind of sketch of the way in which we can think of pain as a functional state. One problem with this is that given this account of what pain is, it seems that countries can feel pain. Yeah, so you might think that Turkey, for example, prefers not to be invaded, probably. Yeah, but it has some sort of preference function. It has kind of it keeps an eye on its border. Okay, let's think of Ukraine. So I don't want to get you in trouble. Ukraine doesn't want to be invaded. It monitors what's going on at its borders. There's something like some external damage that comes from outside, and it responds. You know, there's some sort of response. So you might think that the countries can fulfill this functional description. So that Ukraine has some monitoring of its borders, and of damage to itself. It's got a capacity for learning. Yeah, so it, you know, maybe there's some cyber attack and it doesn't know how to notice it, and then after the attack it learns to be able to recognize certain types of cyber attacks. If you're British, you know, like Brexit, you know, foreign kind of damage to your system, but maybe Britain doesn't learn. I don't know. Yes, maybe Britain lacks capacity for learning. But like most countries, you think have some sort of capacity for learning that have something like preference function. So if we think of pain as a functional state, then why think I can feel pain? But it would seem that Turkey can feel pain. What does Putnam have to say about this?
I think in his later years, he says that everything can, because what I mean is competition is very good.
Yeah, so on page 163, he just rules it out by stipulation. So he says, number 3 on his account is, no organism capable of feeling pain possesses a decomposition into parts which separately possess descriptions of the kind referred to in 2. So that a system can only feel pain if none of its parts are capable of feeling pain. So a community, if we think of Turkey or a country as a community of individuals, and the individuals can feel pain, then this rules that. This just stipulates that something that has parts that feel pain can't feel pain. But then you might think, but that just seems like an arbitrary, unprincipled stipulation. It's going to try and rule out. It just stipulates that only individual organisms can feel pain. Now, but if we think of pain in these functional terms, that stipulation, it just seems an arbitrary stipulation and fits this to our ordinary intuitions about pain. And it seems difficult to understand why we have this stipulation. Because if something fulfills the functional role, but it just happens to be made up of things that themselves are capable of feeling pain, what's the difference in terms of functional role? Yeah, it seems unmotivated. So he just puts in this stipulation number 3 to rule out countries feeling pain, to rule out swarms. So you might think of a beehive. It thinks that if you think of individuals feeling pain, that a hive, and I think hives are quite interesting because you know, they've evolved. They have there are sort of biological functions there. So you might think a swarm of insects that in some sense, you know, is capable of detecting a threat to the hive, and then the kind of the drones that go out and kill the wasps. So, you know, we have one of the big dangers for a hive is a wasp attack. Yeah, and you might think that the hive has got detection mechanisms. So why can't a hive of bees feel pain? You might think like kind of, what about cells? So individual cells, you might think, satisfy this description. But individual cell, there might be damage to its cell membrane, cells set up in such a way that it's, I mean, it's not obvious individual cells can do this, but if it turned out that they could, then it would turn out, given his definition, human beings don't feel pain. Because if individual parts of the human being can feel pain, then, yeah, so this seems quite arbitrary, yeah, this stipulation. And one thing is that we've got, so he says, we've got descriptions of the organism. Now, one thing is that in terms of computation, like I say the pen being here represents 2 plus 3, and pen on the floor represents 5. I can kind of stipulate, yeah? So there's some description of what's going on that me dropping the pen, in some sense, calculates 2 plus 3 equals 5. Yeah, so you can just give arbitrary descriptions to physical things in the world to make them instantiate some sort of calculation. So one problem is we think some of these sort of functional computational descriptions capture what's really going on, and some of them are just arbitrary descriptions of the process. So what makes one description an appropriate description? Yeah, and this is quite hard. Now, when it comes to computers, when it comes to your laptop, a laptop has been designed with a certain type of function in mind. Yeah, so we can say, you know, like the reason it exists is to do this. Yeah, and so this is the cash register was built to calculate how much you spend. And so it's been designed to do addition. So the description of it that as an adding machine is appropriate because its function is to add. And its function is given by the fact that you decided to do it. It seems to me that to have an appropriate description, I think that you do need something akin to some sort of idea of design or function. Yeah? Yep.
Does it entail that when the calculator is doing addition, it's doing the same thing that I am doing in addition? Is it the same thing that we're doing? Because I feel like it's not obvious.
Well, so I think with addition, I think there is, I mean, because this is something we'll talk about next week when we look at Mart. Yeah, but I think with addition, that there are various ways one can do addition. There are various algorithms one could use. And it can be the case that the way in which a machine does it is using the same sort of algorithms we do. So I think with something like addition, thinking in terms of algorithm, you know, addition is something that's really difficult. That it takes, I mean, it takes a lot of training. And the way we do it, we've developed a sort of system of representation, Arabic numerals, that makes it a bit easier. That we have this thing where we go from left to right. So we add up things on the right, far right, you know. Yeah, so the algorithm is we add these up, we add these together, we carry. And so it seems to me that when we do addition, we can ask the question, how do you do this? And I think that's an interesting question. And I think with addition, most people do it like this. But when you think about multiplication, if you look at how different individuals solve quite large multiplication, it turns out that they use different methods to do it. So I think when it comes to something like addition and multiplication and humans doing it, I do think it really does make sense to think about what algorithm are they doing. And I think one reason why this makes sense is that arithmetic is something we've learned and we've been trained at. And the way we've been trained at it is in terms of using certain techniques and using certain rules. Yeah. So it's a sort of, the idea that addition is the rule-governed manipulation of symbols, to me, doesn't seem problematic because that's how we're taught addition. We learn to do maths by learning a bunch of external symbols and then learning how to manipulate them in a rule-governed way. So I think addition, yeah, I mean, feeling pain, it seems less obvious to me. Like, yeah.
When we're doing addition, we know what we're doing. We do it with the intention of getting this number to this number, and we use an algorithm as a tool. But when a machine does it, the algorithm is all there is. So, like in our mind, we want to get to the conclusion and use the algorithm.
Yeah. So I think that, like in some sense, I think that's a perfectly fine way to go. The machine actually isn't doing addition. like you might think that because it doesn't, it's not acting. It doesn't have any intention. It's just taking a bunch of, there's basically a bunch of operations. There's just syntactic, there's just rules, there's no semantics. Yeah, so that for something to be addition, that the things that are manipulated have to be numbers. And so this is only addition is because we interpret these as numbers. And that there's no, the machine doesn't have any sort of semantics. That the symbols are not symbols for the machine. They're only symbols for the user of the machine. You know, that's the sort of Searle type of approach. Do people know John Searle? He's got this very famous article called
Minds, Machines, and Programs.
Minds, Machines, and Programs, yeah, where he has the idea of the Chinese room. Everyone calls it the Chinese room argument, but that's not, he should have just called the paper the Chinese room, and then everyone would know it could minds, brains, and machines. Yeah, but he has this, he sort of says, well, with computers, you've just got syntactic, just got syntax. Yeah, you don't have any semantics. And so one thing about our understanding is that we kind of, when we read some symbols, like, we understand what they mean. And that understanding what a bunch of symbols mean is quite different from the capacity just to manipulate them successfully. Yeah, and the Chinese, do you want to explain the Chinese room argument? Who hasn't, who's never heard of the Chinese room argument? If you're from psychology, okay, so who wants to explain it? Okay.
So he imagines someone in a closed room and
Himself?
yeah, himself.
Me, John Searle, I'm in this room.
Okay. I'm not sure if I remember completely what right. So in the room there is a guide to manipulate Chinese symbols to in certain ways, and he studies these grammatical rules, and then some input from outside the room, gives him some Chinese symbols, and he has a kind of an algorithm to manipulate the given input symbols in a manner that would, when someone from the other side of the room picks the, organized symbols, it would make sense to them. So, but he doesn't know any Chinese, but he studied the rules and algorithms so much that when you add a meaningful Chinese sentence, there's an answer.
Yeah, so like basically, he's in this room, he doesn't understand Chinese, he's just got a bunch of kind of symbols, a bunch of squiggles, but he's been told in English a bunch of rules for kind of, if you get squiggles like this, do this. Yeah, so he's sitting in this room and he gets an input, he looks in his book, and his book tells him, if I get an input like this, these are the kind of, the set of rules about how to manipulate it. and he kind of gives an output. And he's given the kind of rules he's got are so good that he's, in terms of input and output, he's sort of indistinguishable from a native Chinese speaker. Yeah, so basically he passes the Turing test. Yeah, but he says, listen, I don't understand Chinese. You know, there's no understanding there. So passing the Turing test is not sufficient for understanding. Yeah, and we understanding it, we don't understand. I don't understand Chinese, but I could kind of learn. He kind of, if the computationalist is right, I could learn how to successfully produce appropriate responses without any sort of understanding, yeah, in a rule-governed way. And so Searle thinks that, yeah, all you get with computers is syntax, yeah, and really you need an account of semantics, yeah. We actually don't just know how to use words; we know what they mean. An understanding of meaning can't be cashed out in purely algorithmic terms because it misses out the sort of semantics. Now, I'm quite sympathetic to this, you know, but not for Searlean reasons. I think that biological systems are quite different from machines. That's something we're going to be looking at in a week or two. This article by Richardson. But I also think that to have meaning, so we're going to be looking at some Tomasello, and I take it that meaning presupposes some sort of capacity for joint attention, and this is sort of Tomasello's work on language acquisition. Who's a linguist here? Have you ever read any Tomasello? Have you read what have you read?
Something similar to that, but a different type.
Okay, yeah. So Tomasello's really cool. He's a kind of developmental psychologist, stroke primatologist who works on chimpanzees and babies. So he does developmental stuff. But he also kind of has a linguistics background. So his earlier work, I really like, is on language acquisition. And he's very influenced by Wittgenstein. So he has a sort of pragmatic view of language. It's non-Chomsky, it's sort of anti-Chomskyan. It's sort of semantics first, meaning first, and then, you know, the syntax can look after itself. The grammar can kind of emerge. But the really difficult thing in language is semantics. And he thinks that in order for semantics to emerge, you need creatures capable of joint attention. So you need something like a joint attentional frame. So that capacity for reference, like semantics presupposes reference. That's central. And reference, we might think, involves pointing. And pointing is something, his work on primatology is that something that chimps don't do in nature. That pointing is something that is humans do, but chimps don't. Other primates don't. This is the big difference between us and other animals. And this lies at the ground of the possibility of language. And so you might think that for language to work, that one of the things that's central are going to be things like demonstratives, this and that. And I take it that if you're in the Chinese room, that one thing you're not going to be able to understand are demonstratives. Yeah, I mean, if we think about language, a lot of language involves demonstratives and indexicals. Yeah, you know, demonstratives and indexicals. So this, that, here, now. So these are demonstratives. And Tomasello's sort of idea is that demonstratives are only, a grasp of demonstrative is going to be tied to some sort of idea of pointing. Basically, you only really get demonstratives if we've got something like joint attention. And joint attention, if you're in a Chinese room, you haven't got joint attention. Yeah? That's a good question. So I think joint attention is quite an interesting phenomenon, because in joint attention, like I'm looking at this, you're looking at this. And that's not enough for joint attention, because we could not see each other. So the mere fact that we're looking at the same thing is in some sense necessary for joint attention, but sufficient. Yeah, because it's not just that we have to jointly attend, but we have to have common knowledge. Now, one sort of question then is, so I'm attending to it and you're attending to it, and I know that you're attending and you know that I'm attending. Now, that, for various reasons, that's not going to be enough, it seems to be. Yeah, and that you need something like common knowledge. And common knowledge, it gets quite complicated. If you're interested, John Campbell has a nice book called Reference and Consciousness. And it's got a nice article. I can see, if you remind me, I can send it, where he, because so what, I mean, there are two sort of approaches to joint attention. And so one approach thinks that we can understand joint attention just in terms of I'm attending and have some knowledge of you, and you're attending and have some knowledge of me. Yeah, and so that you can reduce joint attention to what's going on in us as individuals. I think for reasons, partly for reasons that you find in Campbell, that you can't do this. So that joint attention is something that's only going to be possible when you've got a system of a pair of individuals and an object, and it's not going to be reducible to my individual internal state and your individual internal state. And when we look at this stuff about Van Gelder next week, he's going to introduce this notion of coupling. Coupling is a kind of technical notion. And I take it that in joint attention, the two individuals have to be coupled so that two individuals form a single system. And I think we've got some evidence of that. So when you look at mothers and babies, and you look at what's going on in their brains, that in some sense, the changes in the baby's brain and the mother's brain are sort of linked to each other. And you can't understand what's going on in that interaction by having a model of the baby and a separate model of the mother. Yeah, because there are certain parameters. You might think there are, there's a neuron firing in the baby's brain and a neuron firing in and these sort of rates of firing are connected to each other. Yeah, that there's a sort of coupling between the two systems such that you can't understand the change of rate of firing in one brain, yeah, without having the other individual in your model. Yeah, so you're not, and I think if this is right, this shows that computationalism can't be right, because it shows that because computationalism thinks you can have a full understanding of an individual just by looking inside the individual, because all you've got is input and output. And in terms of thought, everything interesting can be modeled in terms of what's going on inside the head of a single individual. I take it that if you say that semantics, language requires joint attention, and joint attention requires some sort of coupling, yeah, then any sort of model of how understanding is possible, you're not going to be able to do by looking inside an individual's head, because joint attention is going to be something that can only be modeled by looking at the system as a whole, where the system is basically, the mother, the baby, the world. Yeah, and you have a sort of coupling relation between things going on inside one head and things going on inside the other head. And if that's right, I think this shows that computational models are going to be inadequate for understanding language, because computational models think that you have a model of the baby, a model of the mother, and you can understand fully what's going on in terms of what's going on inside one individual. And I think we've got good reasons to think that's false, which then means that computational models are going to be inadequate. And they're going to be inadequate for language if we think, yeah, so that's my sort of take. Okay, we've gone on for too long. I think I have anyway. You didn't go on at all. Next class, I want to look at section 3 and 4. And we'll talk about Mart. And then next Wednesday, we'll finish off talking about Mart and I'll start talking about Van Gelder. And we're like half a class behind schedule, but that's a lot better than normal. It's kind of, yeah, if you're interested with this Campbell stuff, he's got a nice article on yeah, it's got to do with the seventh game, what's it called? It's he's got a nice argument as to why common knowledge can't be reduced to my knowledge and your knowledge. You have a question?
Yeah.
Right.
The thought that joint attention is necessary for referential language. Is that like a hypothesis of somebody you mentioned? Or
Thomas
just-
yeah. Thomas
So
Yeah.
that's,
Well, yeah, so he,
isn't that like a widely accepted way of looking at it? Like,
I mean, actually, I think he's been very influential. And so there's lots of people who talk about joint attention. I think the stuff about demonstrative is, yeah, so I mean, his use theory of language acquisition is less, so he's sort of, this is a view that puts sort of semantics first.
I guess he thinks that it's also sufficient for referential language, the joint attention. Not you said two ways of thinking about it. Me knowing you, that you attend,
Yeah.
you knowing me attending it. He thinks that it's sufficient, but John Campbell doesn't.
So Tomasello, I think his account of joint attention is too individualistic. So he doesn't, I think, have a. I think Tomasello doesn't. He stresses the importance of joint attention for language, but then he sort of the way he tried to cash out what's required for joint attention, I think is too individualistic. But I don't think there's anything in his overall theory that means he has to be, bye-bye, that means he has to, sorry. Yeah, we're going to be reading, hold on, we're going to be reading Tomasello